All right, let's start. Now, if you remember the first class, we said trade makes people better off. One of the basic economic principles that we learned in the first class. And now, this chapter, we're going to demonstrate how trade can make people better off. So we're going to start off with a simple model. For example, two countries. Suppose we have country A and country B. And then we use a two goods example. That is good X and good Y. So if it works for two countries and two goods, it will work for any country, any number of goods. And now, I post tables that we will be using today. So now we're going to use those tables to speed up the discussion. So now, suppose in country A, and country B, X and Y. So in country A, it costs $40 to produce 1 unit of X. And in country A, it is $20 to produce 1 unit of Y. So this table tells us the production cost per unit of X and Y in country A and country B. And in country B, it costs $20 to produce 1 unit of X and $5 to produce 1 unit of Y. And different countries, they may have different living standards, and they may also have different technology. And that's why the cost of producing the same goods may be different in different countries. So now, with this information, the cost of production for each product in every country, what we want to figure out is absolute advantage. That is the lower cost to produce a product compared to another country. So now, if we look at the production of good X in country A, $40 per unit. In country B, $20 per unit. So in other words, to produce X, it is cheaper because it costs $20 only in country B. So country B has absolute advantage because it is the lower cost. In terms of producing good Y, country B also has absolute advantage. So now, if we look at this, it looks like it costs less to produce both goods in country B compared to country A. Now, this is where a lot of the students mixed up. Absolute advantage is just telling us the lower cost to produce good in a country. But when it comes to the economic cost, we look at the opportunity cost, not the dollar value cost. And therefore, from this information, looking at absolute advantage, we cannot say which country is more efficient in terms of producing a particular product, because this is just the absolute dollar value, not the opportunity cost. And now, if we revisit the idea of opportunity cost, it measures the sacrifice. What you have to give up, whether it's out of your pocket or could have been in your pocket, that is a sacrifice. And with this idea about economic cost, that is opportunity cost, now we can look at these two countries again. Country A and country B. To increase 1 unit of X, or to increase 1 unit of Y. And now, country A, to increase 1 unit of X, we need $40, because it costs $40 in country A to produce 1 unit of X. Where can we find this $40? It must come from the reduction of 2 units of Y, because each unit of Y, as we see from the previous table, each unit of Y costs $20. So if we need to find $40 to produce 1 unit of X, then we need to sacrifice 2 units of Y. And therefore, 1 unit of X will come at the sacrifice of 2 units of Y. In here, to increase 1 unit of Y in country A, we need $20. And it must come from a reduction of half a unit, or 0.5 units of X, because 1 unit of X, $40. So if we sacrifice half the unit of X production, we can save $20, and we can use the $20 to produce 1 unit of Y. And we can do the same for country B. Increase 1 unit of X in country B, we need $20. And it must come from the drop of 4 units of Y, because according to the information, in country B, 1 unit of Y costs $5. So if we need to get $20, we have to give up 4 units of Y production. On the other hand, if we want to increase 1 unit of Y, we need $5. And therefore, it must come from a drop of a quarter, or 0.25 units of X. So now, this table tells us the opportunity cost per unit of this product, X and Y, in country A and in country B. So if we want to produce 1 unit of X in country A, we need to sacrifice 2 units of Y. And in country B, we need to sacrifice 4 units of Y. And now we're going to introduce the idea of comparative advantage. Comparative advantage refers to lower opportunity cost. To produce a product compared to another country. So this is the idea of comparative advantage, which is different from absolute advantage. Absolute advantage is a dollar value cost. In here, comparative advantage, we are talking about the opportunity cost, the sacrifice in terms of the other good. And now, learning about the definition. If we want to have 1 unit of X produced, country A has a smaller sacrifice because it only needs to sacrifice 2 units of Y compared to B. And when we want to produce 1 unit of Y, country B has a smaller sacrifice, only 0.25. And now, what do we find out is a country can have absolute advantage in the production of all the products, but a country can never have comparative advantage in the production of all the products. Why? Well, because if you look at this, the opportunity cost is actually the reciprocal of each other. So if you have a low opportunity cost in one good, then automatically you would have a high opportunity cost of another good. And therefore, a country cannot have comparative advantage in all the products. And now, we have figured out the comparative advantage. Next, without trade, a country is said to be in an autarky position. Which is like a closed economy, that it does not connect or interact with other countries, no trade. So this is autarky position. So now, what we want to figure out is that how these countries would do before trade and how trade can improve these countries. And this simple model can demonstrate the idea trade makes countries better off. Now, country A, country B. First, resources. Suppose country A has $20,000 worth of resources and country B $8,000 worth of resources. And now, here, the maximum X if no Y, or the maximum Y if no X. That is, if these two countries would only be focusing on the production of one product, how much would it get? Well, 1 unit of X in country A costs $40 per unit of X. So if country A is going to put all $20,000 worth of resources to produce X only, it can produce a maximum of 500 units of X. But since this country is using all its resources to produce good X, then nothing will be available to produce good Y. Or if the $20,000 worth of resources is being allocated to produce good Y only, and therefore $20 per unit of Y. No, the absolute advantage chart is just initial information. It's not going to give us any useful information about trade. And now, if country A is going to put all $20,000 worth of resources in the production of good Y, it can produce a maximum of 1,000 units of good Y. We can do the same for country B. Using $8,000 worth of resources in country B to produce only X, $20 per unit, and therefore it can produce a maximum of 400 units of X. Or it can put $8,000 worth of resources to produce only good Y, and it costs 5 units to produce 1 unit of good Y, and therefore it can produce a maximum of 1,600 units of Y. And now, assumption. The cost of production remains unchanged for each good in both countries. So it will make our analysis a little bit simpler by assuming all the costs are fixed. It doesn't matter whether the country is producing 1 unit or 500 units. So why do we need to get this information? Well, because this information will help us figure out the production possibilities frontier. And now, from that table, we can figure out country A and country B, good X and good Y. So, for country A, it can produce a maximum of 500 units of X if it doesn't produce any Y. Or it can produce 1,000 units of Y if it doesn't produce any X. In other words, those numbers in the table in here, we just figure out these are the intercepts for the production possibilities frontier. So this gives us the production possibilities frontier for country A. So those numbers in the tables, when we assume the country produces only 1 good, it helps us figure out these intercepts. And linking up the 2 intercepts, we can figure out the production possibilities frontier for country A. And we use the same method. If country B is producing only good X, it can produce a maximum of 400 units of X. And if it is going to produce only good Y, it can produce a maximum of 1,600 units of Y, linking up these 2 intercepts. We get the production possibilities frontier for country B. $400 units of X, 1,600 units Okay? And now, after we figure out these two production possibilities frontier, then when a country does not trade, then what it consumes must depend on what it produces. So if a country doesn't trade, it can only consume what it produces. So in other words, the production possibilities frontier for country A will be the same as the consumption possibilities frontier for country A if there's no trade. So PPF stands for production possibilities frontier. CPF refers to consumption possibilities frontier. N stands for no trade. Same for country B. If country B is not trading, then the production possibilities frontier for country B, same as the consumption possibilities frontier for country B when there is no trade. When there is no trade, consumption must equals to production. And now we can apply this concept into the graph. Production possibilities frontier is the same as consumption possibilities frontier for country A when there is no trade. The same is true for country B when there is no trade. And now, the next question is, where will this country produce? And where would they consume? To move ahead, we need to make a simple assumption. The assumption of balanced resource allocation. So these assumptions assumes that these countries, they have no preferences or no bias about which products they like. So they like X and Y equally. As a result, they would devote half of their resources to produce each good. So this assumption tells us half the resources will be used to produce X and half the resources will be used to produce Y. So this would help us figure out how much will these countries produce and consume before these countries trade with each other. And because each country is only devoting half the resources in producing each good, and therefore as a result, what they are producing is half of the maximum that they could produce. So this is the point AN. That is, this is where country A will settle when there is no trade. By the same token, this is where country B will settle when there is no trade. And now, we can extend the tables that we just figured out in here, country A and country B. And now what we can figure out is production before trade, X and Y. Country A will be producing 250 units of X and 500 units of Y, which is half the maximum. And country B will be producing 200 units of X and 800 units of Y. And therefore, if we add up these two, before trade, the world production, don't forget we have only two countries, the world production would be 400 units of X and 1,300 units of Y. So that would be the world production before trade. All right? And now, next. Consumption. Country A, country B. Consumption before trade, X and Y. And this is easy because before trade, consumption is the same as production. And therefore, country A without trade, 250 units of X, 500 units of Y. B, 200 units of X, 800 units of Y, which is exactly a copy of what we did earlier about the production before trade. So, before trade, that would be the position for these countries. And now, these countries trading with each other. When these countries interact with each other, which allowed them to specialize in the production with comparative advantage. And we figured that out. Country A comparative advantage is X. Country B comparative advantage is Y. So in other words, when these two countries interact with each other and they will reshuffle their production responsibilities, just like when Canada trading with China, Canada will be focusing on some higher value added product, and China will be focusing on some lower value added product, because that is their competitive advantage, because they have abundant workers. So labor intensive goods to them is cheaper with smaller sacrifice compared to what we have in Canada, because we don't have as much population. So, and now let's make another assumption. Full-scale specialization. with this assumption about full-scale specialization means A would produce only the good it has comparative advantage, and B would only produce the good it has competitive advantage. And now, what we figure out is that with this opening of the economies, now we can figure out the specialization we can figure out country A and country B. Specialization in production with trade. X and Y. Full-scale specialization. So country A would produce only X, that is 500 units, but it will not be producing any Y. Country B would produce 1,600 units of Y, but no X. And now, if we add them up, with trade and specialization, now the global outputs, 500 units of X, 1,600 units of Y. And compared to the production before trade, what do we find? This has increased by 50 units, 450 to 500, when we have specialization and trade. And in here, it has gone up by 300 units compared to before trade. So now, what we see is when we allow trade and specialization, we can use the same resources in the world, but we can produce more output because now countries are taking advantage of what they do best, and they will focus on the production with lower opportunity cost. And if every country is doing the same, then the entire global output will be higher than before. So now, we have figured out the production. That is, country A only produces 500 units of X, and country B only produces 1,600 units of Y. Now, specialization only makes sense if it is followed with trade. That is, these two countries, they will not be happy if they only produce one good and consume one good. The reason why they want to specialize, because they want to consume more. In other words, A will be sending X to B, and B will be sending Y to A. So this is the trade flows. In other words, A export X and imports Y, and B is the opposite. B export Y, import X. And now, the question is, how much would they import and export? So this is where we need the third assumption. Equal bargaining power assumption. So now we assume these two countries, they have equal bargaining power. That is, when they come to the trade talk at the bargaining table, they have the same bargaining power. In other words, if I give you half of what I have, you give me half of what you have. So proportionally, the sacrifice and the payback will be the same for these countries. In other words, if country A exports 250 units of X, which is half of what A has, then country B will do the same, sending half of what it has to country A. So this is what the equal bargaining power assumption is doing. In other words, what we are getting here is the terms of trade. 250X will be traded for 800 units of Y, which is the same ratio as 1 unit of X trading for 3.2 units of Y. Or 1 unit of Y trading for 0.3125 units of X. Either way, these expressions, they are the same ratio. And now, with this figured out, we can figure out the consumption after trade. So country A, country B, consumption after trade, X and Y. Now remember, country A produces 500 units of X, but it exports 250 units of X, and therefore what it can consume is 250 units of X. Country B produces 1,600 units of Y, but it exports 800 units of Y, and therefore it consumes 800 units of Y. And now, country B exports 800 units of Y, and this exports becomes imports in country A, and therefore country A can consume 800 units of Y. And country A exports 250 units of X, and therefore in country B it exports 250 units of X, and that's what country B can consume. And now, if we look at the consumption before trade, here, no, it's just this example to make it easy. So that is half and half. Now, for country A, before trade, after trade, same amount of X. But now, after trade, country A increased 300 units of Y because before trade is 500. After trade is 800. For country B, same quantity of Y, but in here it is gaining 50 units of X. And now, these numbers must be matching the gain in production, because we figured out earlier, with specialization, the world can now produce 300 units more Y, which is YA can consume 300 units more of Y, and also producing 50 units more of X. And this is why country B can now enjoy 50 units more of X. So the increase in production must match the increase in consumption. So if we plot this in the graph, then what we get is this. If A is producing 500 units of X, if it gives up everything it has, then it will get whatever B produces, that is 1600 units of Y. The same here. If B is producing 1600 units of Y, if it gives up everything, it will get everything from X. I mean from A, which is 500 units of X. Now, these two they are representing the consumption possibilities frontier when we have trade. And they are the same because they're actually trading with each other. When we look at these two consumption possibilities frontier, the slope in absolute value term is 1x for 3.2 y, which is the terms of trade. And if we look at the slope of this production possibilities frontier, it is 1x 2y, which is the opportunity cost. The absolute value of the slope is the opportunity cost of this country, 1x 2y. In here is the same. The absolute value of the production possibilities frontier is actually the opportunity cost. That is 1x 4y. So the slope of these consumption and production possibilities frontiers, they are telling us the terms of trade and the opportunity cost. And now here, 800. This is where A will settle when there is trade. One x 3.2y. This is the terms of trade we figured out earlier. And in here, 250. This is where B will settle when we have trade. One y 0.3125 x is coming from here. All right, so now what do we see is that before trade, these two countries will be there. And now with trade, it allows these countries to reach this consumption, which is beyond what they could have achieved on their own. And now this is a visual proof that trade makes these two countries better off, because without trade, they will be consuming less than before. With trade and specialization, we allow these countries to produce more and consume more, so they will be better off. And now, the last question we need to ask is why these countries are interested in trading with each other. So what causes them to trade? Yes, we know they will be better off, but how can we prove it? Well, to prove it, we have all the numbers we need. We just need to learn how to use the numbers. So, for example, we know A produces X and exports X. We know B imports X. And now, in here, 2y and 4y. A export X, B import X. So, what we see in here is that the opportunity cost for country A is 1x 2y. In other words, if country A is going to give up 1x, like exports, then country A must get 2y, which is the minimum required compensation of 2y. If country A does not get 2y's back, it would have no incentive to trade. And therefore, this is the opportunity cost, 1x 2y. And this will be the minimum required compensation. For A to be willing to export X to country B, it must get at least 2y from country B. So that is actually what we call the bottom line. In other words, anything less than 2y, A, not interested. It's based on the opportunity cost that we calculated in the beginning. So now we are learning how to make use of the numbers that we have already calculated. And for B, the opportunity cost for B to get 1 unit of X is 4y. In other words, to import 1 unit of X from A, this would be the maximum willingness to pay. So this 4y, according to the opportunity cost of B, represents the maximum willingness to pay. B will be willing to pay at most 4y to get 1x from country A. And that is also the bottom line for country B. Anything more than 4Y, B not interested to trade with country A. And now, based on the opportunity cost that we calculated at the beginning, we can establish the bottom line for these countries. And bound by the opportunity cost, the bottom lines, this gap represents the feasible range for the terms of trade. That is, when the actual terms of trade is falling within this range, these two countries would have incentive to trade. And in our example, the actual terms of trade is 1x for 3.2y. That is our example terms of trade. And that these two countries will be interested in trading with each other because it is right in the middle, somewhere in between. And now, what do they gain? A gains 1.2 extra Y for every unit of X exported. It exports 250 units of X, and therefore it gains 300 units of Y. And this is exactly matching what we calculated earlier about gains in consumption. So from these feasible terms of trade and the actual terms of trade, we can confirm the gains in consumption, and that gives country A incentive to trade. And for country B, B saves 0.8 units of Y for every unit of X imported. So that's why both countries will be better off when they engage in trade. And now, one final note. If trade makes countries better off, why they often getting into trade dispute? It is not about whether the trade will make them better off or not. It's about greed. Because as you see these terms of trade, the more you can push to the other side, the more you will gain. So the trade dispute is actually coming from the fact that these countries are getting greedy. They want to push it to the other's bottom line as much as possible. So a couple of years ago, Donald Trump said the North American Free Trade Agreement is not good for the Americans. It's simply because the US want to get more from us, want to push it closer to our bottom line. So this is why countries getting into trade dispute. All right. Now, who will gain the most? This model will not be able to tell us, something that we will be touching on after the break. So let's take a 10 minutes break. Okay, let's start. Before the break, we look at the very simple model to demonstrate that trade makes countries better off with these three assumptions. Now, it's just the beginning because these three assumptions sometimes could be quite unrealistic. That is, how can countries without any preference on certain products, how can a country produce only one good and import the other? In reality, we have countries producing the same good as they also import the same good, like Canada. We do produce cars and we do import cars. And equal bargaining power, that is not right, because a bigger country like the US, of course, it will have more bargaining power than Canada, because we're only 10% of the size of the US economy. How can we bargain or negotiate with a country that is 10 times bigger? For example, if you are 200 pounds and you try to negotiate the way into an elevator with a 2,000-pound guy, good luck. So this could be very unrealistic, but that is not the important issue of that simple model. Most important thing that is lacking is no supply or demand framework and no price. We know price is a signal in the market, and that is just a beginning to demonstrate the idea trade will make people better off. But also, when we have free trade, the country, of course, better off. But within the country, there will be losers, there will be winners. Even though the country overall is better off, but when we put the country under the microscope, there will be winners and losers from free trade. And not to mention, if we have trade barriers, that will even be more complicated than the model can handle. So now let's go to the supply and demand framework and we examine the trade issues. Suppose we have country A, the domestic supply in country A, price equals to 40 plus 0.5 times the quantity in country A. That is the supply from domestic producers. That's why we call this domestic supply. And from this equation, what do we see is that if the price in country A goes up by 1, then the supply would increase by 2 units. And the domestic demand, the price equals to 240 minus 0.5 times the quantity. In other words, if the price in country A drops by 1 unit, then there will be increasing quantity demand by 2 units. And this represents the vertical intercept of the domestic supply and domestic demand in country A. And now with these two supply and demand equation in country A, we can plot the supply and demand curve in country A. So this is the domestic demand in country A, intercept 240, and the supply with the intercept 40, this gives us the domestic supply in country A. Now, of course, we can solve it using equation, but this is how we can solve it by plotting the supply and demand curve. So the point is the domestic equilibrium, which is here. The quantity is, are we off a little bit? Yes, this is off a little bit. The domestic demand for country A the domestic supply in country A. So the domestic equilibrium price in country A is 140. And the domestic equilibrium quantity in country A is 200 here. So now what we figure out from this graph is that the domestic equilibrium in country A with this domestic equilibrium price 140 and the domestic equilibrium quantity 200, then we can calculate the consumer surplus in country A with the domestic equilibrium quantity. That is this triangle. The height 240 minus 140. That is the height. The base 200 divided by 2. And therefore, this will give us 10,000 as a consumer surplus. And the producer surplus in the domestic equilibrium for country A, the height 140 minus 40, the base 200 divided by 2, it also gives us 10,000 in producer surplus. Therefore, the total surplus is equal to 20,000. That is, when there is no trade, domestic supply equals to domestic demand. This will be the equilibrium position for country A. And now, country B. Suppose in country B, the domestic supply price equals to 20 plus 0.5 times quantity. In other words, when the price goes up by 1, the quantity supply will go up by 2 units. This will be the vertical intercept of the domestic supply curve in country B. And the domestic demand in country B, price equals to 180 minus 0.5 times the quantity. And therefore, if the price in country B drops by 1, then there will be increase in quantity demand in country B by 2 units. And this will be the vertical intercept. And now, with this information, we can figure out the supply and demand. All right, so plotting these two supply and demand curves, we know that the domestic supply and demand, they have the vertical intercept of 180 and 20. And therefore, when we plot the domestic supply for country B, this is what it looks like. The domestic supply for country B and the domestic demand for country B. The equations will be given. If you see these kind of questions in the exam, just like what you saw in the midterm, you'll be given the supply and demand equation to work with. So now, this will be the equilibrium quantity in country B in the domestic equilibrium. And this will be the domestic equilibrium price in country B, where supply equals to demand. And now, after we plot the supply and demand curve, what we see is when there is no trade, the domestic equilibrium in country B, the price is 100. The quantity is 160. And therefore, we can figure out the consumer surplus in country B in the domestic equilibrium. The height is 180 minus 100. The base is 160 divided by 2. That is 6,400. The producer's surplus in domestic equilibrium for country B is the height 100 minus 20 times 160 divided by 2, which also happens to be 6,400. Therefore, the total surplus in the domestic equilibrium for country B, 12,800. So there is no trade. This would be the situation. And now, when these two countries trade, and what kind of price would we see? Then we need to use these graphs to help us figure out the import demand and export supply. So now, suppose this is the world price. For country A, the quantity supply in country A and the quantity demand in country A. And that gives us the export supply in country A and the import demand in country A. So what do we do is we start with the domestic equilibrium price for country A, 140, and we try to raise it by 20 from 160 to 180 and drop it from 140 to 120 to 100. Imports demand, export supply. So if we look at country A, when the world price is the same as the domestic equilibrium price 140, then the quantity supply is 200, the quantity demand also 200. And therefore, there is nothing to export and nothing we need to import because domestic supply equals to domestic demand. When the price goes up by 20, then according to the graph, when the price is 160, then there would be the demand and supply will become 160 and 240. Because if you look at the graph, when the price is 160, then the domestic supply will be 240. The domestic demand will be 160. And therefore, supply greater than demand, that means now we have some excess supply that we can supply to the world market. As a result, there will be 80 units of export supply to the world market. And if it goes up by another 20, then it will be 280 and 120. And therefore, we will be supplying 160 units to the world market. So by the same token, if the price drops to 120, it will be 160 quantity supply, but here will be 240. Then in country A, we will want to buy 240 units, but the domestic producers are only producing 160 units, and therefore we need to import 80 units. If the price drops by another 20, so it becomes 120 and 280, then we need to import 160 units. So as the world price move around the domestic equilibrium price, then what do we see in here is that when the world price is above domestic equilibrium price, this country becomes exporting country. When the world price is below the domestic equilibrium price, this country will become an importing country. And we can do the same for country B. World price, the quantity supply in country B, the quantity demand in country B, the export supply in country B, and the import demand in country B. We start off with the domestic equilibrium price in country B, which is 100. And then we jump 20 units at a time, or drop 20 units at a time. When we are at domestic equilibrium in country B, quantity supply equals to quantity demand, 160. Nothing to export and no need to import. When the price goes up to 120, according to country B, when the price is 120, the quantity supply is 200 here. The quantity demand is 120. So we need supply greater than demand. We have 80 units excess supply that we can sell to foreign markets. That will be the export supply. If it goes up another 20, so it becomes 240, and it becomes 80. As a result, we would have 160 units for export. Like country A, in country B, when the world price is above domestic equilibrium price, this country will be an exporting country. When the price drops 120 and 200, quantity demand greater than quantity supply, then we will need to import 80 units to satisfy the excess demand in this country. When it drops further, then we will need to import 160 units. And therefore, when the world price is below the domestic equilibrium price, then it will turn a country to an importing country. And now, we have the export supply and import demand for each country. What we need to do is to use the information to determine the world price. That is, if at 140, this is the domestic equilibrium price for country A. And when the price is 160, we will supply 80 units to the world market. That is, when it is 160, we will supply 80 units to the world market. When it is 180, then country A will supply 160 units to the world market. So from those 2 points, we figured out the export supply for country A. The opposite is true. When it is dropped to 120, then country A will import 80 units. When it drops to 100, country A will import 160 units. When we link this up, this will give us the import demand for country A. And we can do the same for country B, starting at 100. This is the domestic equilibrium for country B. When it is 120, according to what we figured out in here for country B, when the world price is 120, country B will export 80 units, which is here. When it is 140, then it will export 160 units. So if we link this up, this will give us the export supply for country B. And when it is 80, import 80. 60, it will import 160. And this, we can figure out the import demand for country B. So using all the information that we figured out, now in the world market, the export supply equals to the import demand. Here, there will be 80 units, which is what export from country B, which is also what country A import. So that is the equilibrium trade float. What import demand from A equals to the export supply from B. And therefore, this will be the world equilibrium price, 120. So now, we learn how to figure out the equilibrium world price to determine the trade float. We no longer need to assume equal bargaining power. So now we have determined the equilibrium price in the world market, 120. So country A when the world equilibrium price is 120. So what do we see? Is here. This is the world equilibrium price, 120. And in country A, this will be the quantity demand, and this will be the quantity supply. In other words, this is the import demand in country A, which is 80 units. The imports. And now we can figure out the producer surplus and the consumer surplus. So now in country A, when there is trade and the world equilibrium price is 120, and the consumer surplus in country A, when there is trade, equals to this triangle. Area below the demand curve, all the way to the quantity demand, 240, to the price 120. So in other words, when there is trade in country A, the consumer surplus, 240 minus 120, which is the height. And the base is quantity demand, which is 240, divided by 2. So this comes to 14,400. And the producer surplus in country A, when there is free trade, is this area below the price, above the supply curve, up to the quantity supplied, which is 160 units. So the height is 120 minus 40. The base is 160 units, quantity supplied, divided by 2, that's 6,400. And therefore, the total surplus in country A, when there is trade, is 20,800. And now, what do we see? This is country A, which is an importing country. So for an importing country, consumers better off, but the producers worse off. But overall, the country is better off. Now, what we did before the break, the simple model, only tells us the country overall is better off. But without the supply and demand framework, that simple model would not tell us who are the winners and who are the losers when we have free trade. And now, let's look at country B. Country B, the world price is 120. This is the world price, 120. And then the quantity supply is 200. The quantity demand, 120. And now we can figure out the consumer surplus and producer surplus. When there is trade, this country is an exporting country. And the world price is 120. And the consumer surplus, when there is trade for country B, the height is 180 minus 120. The base is based on the quantity demand, which is 120. Divided by 2, this is 3,600. The producer surplus in country B, when there is trade, is 120 minus 20. So this is the height. And the base, it is selling 200 units. Divided by 2. So it comes to 10,000. And the total surplus, when there is trade, 13,600. Yes, when domestic demand is greater than domestic supply, the gap must be filled by foreign producers, like imports. And now we can figure out the entire country is better off, but for an exporting country, the domestic consumers will be losers. The domestic producers are the winners. So even in free trade, we would have winners and losers. For example, in Canada, we export a lot of oil sand to the US. And we, as consumers, we pay the world price, even though we literally have oil coming out from our own backyard in Alberta. But our consumer surplus drops because if we want to use oil like gasoline at the gas station, we have to pay the world price. Otherwise, no one will sell that to us. So that's why in exporting country, the consumers will be the losers and the producers will be the winners, like the big oil company in Canada. They keep on making record profits. And now, let's go back to country A. Importing country. Producers are the losers. Losers would not go away quietly. So what do they do? Well, they are going to lobby the government for protection. Now suppose these losers, they lobby the government to impose a $10 tariff, that is the import tax, then what would happen? If there's a $10 tariff or import tax, that means everyone in country A must pay the world price plus the tariff, that is 130. And now, if that is the case, then with the tariff, this is 130. And with 130, the quantity demand will drop to 220. But the quantity supply would improve to 180. So the result of the tariff is to reduce imports from 80 units down to 40 units. 220 minus 180. Now we're only importing 40 units. And now, the tariff revenue is equal to the tariff, $10 per unit, 40 units, 400, which is this area. So that is the tariff revenue. And now, let's figure out the consumer surplus and producer surplus when we have tariff. So now when we have tariff, the price is 130. And consumers in country A purchase 220 units. And therefore, the consumer surplus, when we have tariff in country A, that is the height 240 minus $130 times 220 divided by 2. Which is equals to 110 times 110, 12,100. And the producer surplus, when we have tariff, is the height 130 minus 40 times 180 units divided by 2. That is 8,100. And therefore, the total surplus in country A, when there is tariff, is equal to 20,200. And now, what do we see? Is that when we have tariff, the consumer will be worse off, but the producers will be better off. And the total surplus is equal to the consumer surplus plus producer surplus. But this time, we need to add the tariff revenue. Why do we need to add the tariff revenue? Because this tariff revenue, 400, is where the government get the money. And the government will use the money to provide public services to people in the society. And the people can enjoy these $400. So in other words, compared to free trade, what do we see is a loss, what we call the deadweight loss. Because under free trade, the total surplus is equal to 20,800. Yes, because the total surplus under free trade, no tariff, 20,800 that we figured out earlier. And with the tariff, it's only 20,600. So the difference between these two is the deadweight loss, 200. That is, the society will be worse off by 200 because of the tariff. And now you understand why Donald Trump is so stupid when he imposes tariff on imports. And he said he's going to make America great again. How? Making the American economy suffering deadweight loss? Is it the way to make the America great again? I don't think so. So next, where are the deadweight loss? Is these two triangles. These are the triangles for the deadweight loss. How do we explain this triangle for the deadweight loss? We need to magnify this area. So if this is the domestic demand, and this is 130, 120, and this is the quantity 240, and this is the quantity 220, and that is the deadweight loss. Because demand represents marginal benefits. And for these reduced units, due to tariff, these reduced units, the marginal benefit is here, but the cost to get these units is down here. And therefore, the tariff will push people away from capturing this benefit from the import. And that is a loss. What about the other triangle on the left-hand side? Well, the triangle on the left-hand side is from the domestic supply. 130, 120, 160, 180. So that is a deadweight loss. So we know that supply represents the marginal cost. And now, this is the increased units. So in here, we have the reduced units because of tariffs. But here we have increased units due to tariff. These units are coming from domestic producers that they were pushed out of business because they were not efficient and they could not compete with foreign producers. And that's why they got pushed out of the market. But now they are back in business because of the protection behind the tariff. And now when they are back in business, the cost for them to produce is higher than what we could reach to get this unit from foreign producers. So if we can get this unit for $120, why do we need the inefficient domestic producers to produce these units for us at a higher cost than what we could pay to get this unit from foreign producers? And allowing these inefficient domestic producers back in business is a waste of our resources, which is this triangle. And therefore, tariff or trade barriers is a terrible idea. You are not punishing the foreign producers. In fact, you are punishing the domestic economy, like Donald Trump, when he imposed tariffs on imports from Canada, from China, from Europe. He was actually punishing the Americans, not us, not the Europeans, not the Chinese. So obviously he doesn't know what he's talking about, and obviously he doesn't know what he's doing. All right, so that's it for this term. And this is all we need to cover for the trade issue. Okay, don't forget, we do have tutorial today. You're welcome. All right, bye now. Take care. Oh, the final exam. The final exam will have the same format as the midterm. Multiple choice, problems from tutorial, and the lecture discussion, just like the midterm, but a little bit longer. And it is not cumulative. That means the final exam will only cover materials that after the midterm. I believe the midterm covers only chapters 1 to 6. And therefore, the final exam will cover from chapter 7 to chapter 15. Yes. I would post the practice question on Kirkus. You will have at least 1 week to do the practice questions. And I will announce the final format of the final exam once I have set it up, somewhere around next week. Yes, we are using CrowdMark. You're welcome. Well, the sampling questions for chapters 13, 14, and 15, they are on sampling now. Well, thank you. I will schedule the final exam office hours, and I will make announcement on Kirkus to tell you the time that I will hold office hours for the final exam. All right. Okay. So I'm going to stop recording and log off from this session and get ready for the tutorial. It's going to start in 5 minutes. Bye, everyone.